Hello everybody, thank you for watching my video. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. The history of the Tower of London is quite remarkable. Built by William the Conqueror during the Norman Conquest, with further defences added later on, the tower is one of England's most enduring legacies from the Middle Ages, and has seen everything from executions of some of history's most famous people to its somewhat less sinister use as a zoo, although the tower's primary function was of course a palace and fortress. In this video I shall look at some of the defining events from the tower's history during the medieval period. The tower also served as a prison, and one of its earliest prisoners was Ranulph Flambard, a bishop of Durham. In 1101 Ranulph managed to escape, and according to legend, he did so by getting his guards completely drunk and using the ropes from the barrels of wine to abseil down the castle wall. If you visit the tower, you may very well hear one of the yeoman warders speak about this particular tale. There is a strong possibility, though, that this story was embellished by chroniclers of the time. In the 13th century, the tower went under some extensive strengthening work during the reigns of Henry III and Edward I. In Henry's case, the work was necessary as tensions between he and his nobles grew. Heavy sums were spent by Henry, which was not overly popular, as his handling of finances was already a major cause of contention during his reign. Henry also rebuilt Westminster Abbey. Whilst we may be thankful to Henry today for leaving the landmarks that we now see, his spending on projects like these, as well as on more far-fetched schemes such as claiming the throne of Sicily for his son, saw his popularity decline rapidly. In 1381, the Peasants' Revolt broke out, with much of the southeast of England's lower classes now up in arms. With London set ablaze, the 14-year-old king at the time, Richard II, fled to the Tower for safety. Unfortunately for some who accompanied him, they would not be as safe as the king was. The peasants made their way to the Tower, and although they stated that Richard was not one of their targets, the lives of some of those around Richard were now most certainly in grave danger. This included Richard's treasurer, Robert Hales, and his Archbishop of Canterbury and Chancellor, Simon Sudbury. The rebels breached the Tower, and Hales and Sudbury were among those hacked to death. Richard's young cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, was also a target, but saved by a Tower guard. The Peasants' Revolt was a dark stain in the Tower's history. On a slightly more light-hearted note, the Tower, at various times throughout its history, was home to many different types of wild animals, and Henry III virtually created a medieval zoo. He was the recipient of many wild animals being given to him by foreign rulers. This included a polar bear given to him by the King of Norway. Sadly, the unfortunate polar bear did not last long and died due to the disgusting conditions of the River Thames, which it had been swimming in. Other animals housed at the Tower during Henry's reign included lions, tigers, and an elephant. The elephant had been given to him by the King of France, Louis IX. Londoners came in their numbers to see the unusual visitors at the Tower, although seeing the sight of many animals at the Tower of London must have been a cause of some bemusement to Henry's nobility. The history of the Tower in the 15th and 16th century began to take a more dark and sinister turn. This is in part due to the disappearance of King Edward V and his younger brother Richard. The 12-year-old Edward had been wrongfully usurped by his uncle, who became King Richard III. Edward was to be kept at the Tower, with his uncle acting as his guardian. Initially, Edward and his brother were seen playing together, but over time, sightings of them grew less and less, until eventually these sightings stopped altogether. The only realistic and logical answer is Richard had them murdered. He was king, and as king, he would have known all the comings and goings at the Tower of London. For anybody else to have successfully carried out a plot against Edward would have required either Richard III turning a blind eye, or showing a staggering level of ignorance, which he was probably not capable of, considering he was a highly intelligent man. In the 17th century, some bones were discovered underneath the staircase at the tower, which were declared at the time to be the remains of the two tragic boys. They are now buried at Westminster Abbey in Innocents' Corner. Will we ever know their full story? The 16th century saw 3 queens of England executed at the Tower. The most tragic of these was Jane Grey, the 16-year-old girl who fell victim to the lust for power and machinations of her father-in-law, John Dudley. Dudley was a member of the government of Edward VI, and he managed to persuade the dying young king to write his Catholic half-sister, Mary, out of the line of succession and replace her with the Protestant Jane. Jane is known as the 9-Day Queen, as Mary marched in and reclaimed her crown. For several months it appeared as though Jane may get a reprieve, but she was a potential figurehead for rebellions, which sought to remove the Catholic Queen and replace her with Jane, and Jane was eventually beheaded inside the walls of the Tower of London in 1554. The most famous of the executions at the Tower was Anne Boleyn, who was beheaded by a swordsman in May of 1536. Another wife of Henry VIII to die at the Tower was Catherine Howard, who was also little more than a girl. Alongside these 3 tragic 16th century women, a number of men also died alongside them, but have largely been forgotten about. This includes Jane Grey's husband, the 18 or 19-year-old Guildford Dudley. For all its long history, the Tower is now probably most associated with the violence of the Tudor dynasty. As I conclude this video, it's worth remembering I've only begun to scratch the surface of the Tower's remarkable past. I've not discussed other figures like Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell or Walter Raleigh who died here. I've also not discussed some of the Tower's great mysteries, like did George, Duke of Clarence, really die in a barrel of wine here in 1478? Also, who killed Henry VI in 1471? Was it Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as many suspect, who was behind the killing of Henry in the Tower? This is the same Richard who was probably behind the disappearance of Edward V. We've also not discussed the Welsh prince who tried to escape from the Tower only to fall to his death. The history of the Tower of London is almost endless, and it's no wonder it continues to be the massive draw it is today.